The morning of that fateful Sunday began like any other in the affluent Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. Birds chirped softly outside manicured estates. The sun cast a golden hue over the palm-lined streets, and the city that never truly sleeps hummed in its usual rhythm. But behind the closed doors of one particular mansion, a nightmare was unfolding that would shock Hollywood and the world alike. By the afternoon, the news would break. Actor-director Rob Reiner and his wife, photographer and producer Michelle Reiner, had been found dead. And the person allegedly responsible for aiding the perpetrator? Their own daughter, Tracy Reiner. Imagine living a life surrounded by fame, privilege, and the glimmering sheen of Hollywood success, only to have that same world erupt into unimaginable horror. This was not just a tragedy. It was a mystery, a family imploding in real time, a chain of events so unbelievable that it reads like the plot of a dark psychological thriller. But unlike the movies, this story was real. Lives were lost, a family torn apart, and a community left grappling with questions that may never be fully answered. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. So how did we get here? How did the daughter of one of Hollywood's most beloved directors end up in the middle of a story so gruesome it seems impossible? And what could have possibly driven someone to betray the people who gave them life, love, and opportunity? These are the questions that haunt this case, questions that no one in the public eye could have prepared for, and yet they would soon dominate headlines, courtrooms, and social media feeds around the globe. It all began with Nick Reiner, Tracy's brother, 32 years old, a figure who had been mostly quiet in the shadows of a family that thrived in the limelight. Sources close to the family describe him as complicated, unpredictable, and at times volatile, traits that had always kept friends and relatives on edge. But even the most alarming warnings could not have predicted what would unfold that Sunday morning. According to court documents, Nick allegedly committed the unthinkable, fatally stabbing his parents in their Brentwood home before fleeing the scene. And then there was Tracy. While Nick was apprehended, her role emerged as both shocking and controversial. Allegedly, she gave aid to her brother during and after the crime. The details are still emerging, but initial reports indicate she may have assisted him in ways that, if proven true, crossed the line from familial loyalty into criminal complicity. It is a revelation that has left Hollywood stunned, fans heartbroken, and law enforcement scrambling to piece together the timeline of events. Consider the shockwave this sent through the entertainment world. Rob Reiner, celebrated for his work in films that defined generations, was more than just a filmmaker. He was a father, a husband, a mentor, and a figure whose very name evokes creativity and trust. Michelle Reiner, equally accomplished in her own right, captured the world through the lens of her camera, creating art that celebrated life, emotion, and human connection. And yet, both were brutally taken in a crime that now has every Hollywood insider whispering, speculating, and questioning what they thought they knew about the Reiner family. The timing only added to the intensity. Brentwood is not a neighborhood accustomed to violence of this magnitude. It's a place where privacy is prized, where front lawns are manicured to perfection, and where the occasional paparazzi intrusion is the height of drama. And yet, in this serene setting, horror struck in the most intimate of spaces, a family home. It's a jarring juxtaposition, the kind that makes you wonder. If this could happen to the Reiners, to those wrapped in wealth and privilege, who could truly feel safe? Even more haunting are the details that continue to emerge. Reports indicate that the bodies of Rob and Michelle were discovered on Sunday afternoon, hours after the alleged crime took place. Neighbors reported unusual activity, a car speeding away, and an eerie silence where normally laughter, music, or the hum of daily life would be heard. Police arrived on the scene to find a house marked by violence and chaos, a home that once symbolized love, now a scene of tragedy. And at the center of it all was Tracy, the daughter, whose actions in the aftermath have raised uncomfortable questions about loyalty, morality, and the limits of family bonds. What could compel someone to assist a sibling in such a heinous act? Was it fear, love, obligation, or something darker, something buried beneath layers of family dynamics and Hollywood secrets? Each new revelation seems to pull the story in a more unsettling direction, leaving everyone who hears it grappling with disbelief and shock. And as the trial unfolds, the world is watching, dissecting every motion, every tear, every statement made in court. Tracy Reiner's very presence in the courtroom has become a point of fascination. Reports describe her collapsing after the judge announced the life sentence for the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner. A moment that was both human and surreal, blending grief, guilt, and possibly shock in a way that no one could have predicted. Yet, even amid the devastation, there are details that hint at something deeper, a web of relationships, resentments, and hidden conflicts that have remained under the radar for years. Friends and acquaintances speak of tension between siblings, unspoken arguments, and the pressures of living in a family whose every move is scrutinized by Hollywood and the public alike. While these may seem like small details, in hindsight they form the pieces of a puzzle that explain, at least in part, the storm that erupted that Sunday morning. And the courtroom drama is just beginning. Every day brings new testimonies, revelations, and twists that keep audiences worldwide on edge. As prosecutors lay out their case, the narrative grows more complex. Surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and digital evidence all add layers to an already shocking story. And each new piece of evidence seems to answer some questions while raising dozens more. How did Tracy become involved? What did she know, and when did she know it? Could the tragedy have been prevented, or was this the inevitable outcome of a family fractured by secrets and unresolved tensions? But what truly sets this story apart is the human element. Behind the sensational headlines, behind the Hollywood glamour, are real lives shattered, real grief, and a family legacy forever stained by violence. Fans of Rob Reiner's films are mourning not just a director, but the loss of a father and husband. Friends of Michelle are remembering her art, her smile, her presence, all cut tragically short. And Tracy, whether innocent or complicit, is left to navigate the consequences of a crime that has captured global attention and left an indelible mark on her family's name. So, why does this story matter now? Beyond the lurid details and shocking headlines, it's a story about family, morality, and the fragile nature of human relationships. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How well do we truly know the people we love? What lines will someone cross for family? And in a world obsessed with fame and success, how often do the pressures of legacy and public perception push people to the brink? In the next hour, we'll take you behind the headlines. We'll explore the Reiner family dynamics that may have led to this tragedy, dissect the timeline of events that Sunday morning, and examine the shocking courtroom moments that left viewers stunned. We'll speak to sources close to the family, analyze evidence from law enforcement reports, and uncover the small but telling details that paint a fuller picture of this Hollywood nightmare. And just when you think you've understood the story, the twists will begin. Because in cases like this, nothing is ever as it seems. Allies become suspects, loyalty becomes betrayal, and every revelation only deepens the mystery. The next chapters will take you closer to the truth, but be warned. Some truths are far darker than you can imagine. Hollywood has a way of seducing the world with glitz, glamour, and the illusion of perfection. Cameras flash, red carpets shimmer, and celebrities live lives that seem enviable to outsiders. But behind every perfect facade, there is a story often untold, a web of human complexity, struggles, and family dynamics that remain hidden from the public eye. This is exactly where the Reiner family's story begins. Not in headlines or courtrooms, but in the homes, memories, and relationships that defined them long before tragedy struck. Rob Reiner, at 78, had built a career that many would envy. From his iconic roles on screen to his legendary work behind the camera, he was a Hollywood fixture. Films like This Is Spinal Tap, The Princess Bride, and A Few Good Men cemented his reputation as a visionary director with a unique voice. But while the public saw his creative brilliance, those closest to him understood another side. A father deeply committed to his children, a husband devoted to his wife, and a man carrying the weight of decades of fame, expectations, and private challenges. Michelle Reiner, aged 70, brought her own artistry to the world. A talented photographer and producer, she documented life with an eye for authenticity, capturing moments that were often intimate, vulnerable, and raw. Together, Rob and Michelle presented the image of a power couple whose success was only matched by their love and dedication to family. Friends described them as warm, generous, and protective of their children. But as with any family, the public image masked a far more complicated reality. Enter Tracy Reiner, the daughter who would later become a central figure in a story that shocked the world. Tracy grew up surrounded by fame and creative energy. Cameras were a constant presence, and the pressures of living in the Reiner household were unlike any ordinary upbringing. For a child, navigating parental expectations, sibling rivalries, and the scrutiny of Hollywood was no small feat. Sources described Tracy as bright, creative, and independent, yet at times caught in the complex dynamics that often define families with fame, money, and power. Then there was Nick Reiner, the younger son, 32 years old at the time of the incident. Unlike Tracy, he largely lived away from the limelight, described by acquaintances as reserved but intense, someone who bore his own inner struggles quietly. Family insiders later revealed tensions and disagreements that had festered over the years, minor disputes that seemed trivial to outsiders, but, in the insulated world of the Reiners, carried significant emotional weight. So what was life like in the Reiner household before that tragic Sunday? It was a world of privilege, yes, but also one of high expectations and pressure. Imagine growing up knowing the eyes of the world were always watching, knowing that any misstep could become public fodder. Imagine sibling rivalries amplified by fame, every disagreement magnified, every argument potentially splashed across tabloids. For Tracy and Nick, this reality was a daily undercurrent, shaping their identities, ambitions, and relationships in ways few could understand. But there was love too. Despite the pressures, friends and colleagues recall moments of family warmth and unity. Holiday gatherings, movie premieres, and quiet evenings at home painted a picture of a family that, from the outside, appeared close-knit and happy. Rob and Michelle worked tirelessly to nurture their children, supporting their creative pursuits and personal growth. Yet, as is often the case, the deeper emotional currents within the family remained largely unseen, even by those who loved them most. And yet, cracks had already begun to show. In hindsight, some sources suggest that the relationship between Nick and Tracy was strained, though the nature of the tension is unclear. Was it sibling rivalry? A clash of personalities? Or something deeper, resentment, frustration, or fear? Whatever the cause, it is undeniable that by the time tragedy struck, unresolved tensions had laid the groundwork for a chain of events no one could have predicted. Even the parents' dynamic provides important context. Rob, with his larger-than-life persona, could be intense and commanding, while Michelle, equally passionate in her own right, often served as the emotional anchor of the family. Friends described their marriage as loving but complex, full of both laughter and moments of tension, a partnership forged through decades of navigating Hollywood's unpredictable landscape. This mix of intensity, love, and high expectations created an environment that, while outwardly glamorous, was also emotionally charged and, at times, fragile. It's also essential to consider the pressures that come with fame. The Reiners were constantly in the public eye, whether through Rob's film career, Michelle's photography, or family appearances at Hollywood events. Privacy was a luxury they could seldom afford. The weight of public scrutiny often intersects with personal challenges in ways that can exacerbate conflicts, strain relationships, and complicate decisions. For Tracy and Nick, growing up in this environment meant internalizing pressures that might have seemed invisible to outsiders, but were profoundly real in their daily lives. But what happens when these pressures collide with tragedy? When a family, already under strain, faces an unthinkable act of violence? Every relationship, every unresolved tension, every past argument comes under a harsh spotlight. In the case of the Reiners, this collision would be catastrophic. The idyllic image of a Hollywood family, laughter echoing through Brentwood streets, success and creativity surrounding them, would be shattered by an act so violent and shocking that it defied comprehension. By understanding the family's history, their personalities, and the environment in which they lived, we begin to see how this tragedy, while unthinkable, was rooted in a complex mix of human emotions, familial dynamics, and high-pressure circumstances. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about love, loyalty, and the bonds that hold families together. And yet, the full scale of what happened on that Sunday morning remains almost impossible to fathom, even with this context. As we peel back the layers, one thing becomes clear. The Reiner family was not immune to the darker realities of human behavior. Wealth, fame, and success do not inoculate against tragedy, and sometimes, the very elements that create a life of privilege also create the conditions for unimaginable events. The events of that Sunday are a stark reminder of how fragile life can be, even for those who seem untouchable, even for those whose names are written in the annals of Hollywood history. But the question that lingers, and one that will drive us deeper into this story, is this. How did a day that began like any other spiral into a sequence of events so horrifying that the world could not look away? How did Tracy Reiner, the daughter who had grown up in this complex, high-pressure environment, end up in the eye of a storm that would leave two parents dead and a family forever scarred? Sunday mornings in Brentwood are typically serene. The streets are quiet, lined with towering palms swaying in the gentle breeze, and the distant hum of Los Angeles life seems muffled in this affluent enclave. But on that fateful Sunday, the calm was only a facade. Behind the gates of the Reiner estate, a storm was quietly brewing, one that would erupt in a way that shocked Hollywood and the world alike. The day began like any other, at least on the surface. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were reportedly awake early, as was typical for the couple. Rob, known for his meticulous routine, often started his mornings reviewing scripts, responding to emails, or preparing for upcoming projects. Michelle, ever the artist, would begin her day reviewing photographs or planning shoots. But that morning, ordinary routines collided with extraordinary tragedy. Neighbors would later report seeing unusual activity outside the Reiner home in the early hours. A car, reportedly driven by Nick Reiner, was spotted leaving the estate at a speed that seemed unusual even for Brentwood standards. The streets, normally quiet at that hour, carried a sense of tension, though no one yet understood the significance. Behind closed doors, events were unfolding that would soon shock the community and the world. According to law enforcement reports, the alleged attack occurred in the early morning hours, though the exact timeline is still under investigation. What is clear is that Rob and Michelle Reiner were fatally stabbed in their own home. The violence, sudden and brutal, left the once safe and cherished family space transformed into a scene of horror. It is the kind of act that defies comprehension, a moment when love and family bonds were shattered in an instant, leaving behind grief, confusion, and unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Tracy Reiner's role begins to emerge. Allegations suggest that she assisted her brother in ways that remain the focus of intense scrutiny. While the details are not fully confirmed, sources indicate that her involvement was significant enough to prompt charges of aiding and abetting a crime. For the public, this revelation is both shocking and deeply unsettling. How does a daughter, a child raised with love, family loyalty, and privilege, end up allegedly assisting in the aftermath of her parents' murder? It is a question that has gripped journalists, law enforcement, and the global audience following the case. As the morning progressed, the Reiner's absence was noted by neighbors and friends. Unlike typical Sundays, when the family might have been seen enjoying breakfast or morning routines, the estate remained eerily quiet. Calls to the couple went unanswered, and messages were left with no reply. The unease grew, but no one could have anticipated the discovery that awaited them. By Sunday afternoon, the unthinkable became reality. Law enforcement arrived at the estate after reports from concerned neighbors. The front gates, normally a symbol of privacy and security, now served as the entry point to a scene that would haunt investigators. Inside, Rob and Michelle were found deceased, victims of a violent act that seemed almost unimaginable given their public personas and the serene neighborhood in which they lived. For the first responders, the scene was surreal. Here were two individuals who had spent their lives in the public eye, now reduced to victims of a private, brutal act. The juxtaposition was jarring, the glamour of Hollywood meeting the stark, raw horror of human violence. For neighbors and the wider community, the shock was profound. How could this happen here, in this quiet, affluent neighborhood, to a family so respected and seemingly normal. The discovery sent ripples through both the local community and the entertainment world. News outlets scrambled to confirm details, social media exploded with speculation, and Hollywood insiders expressed disbelief. This was not just a crime. It was a rupture of the narrative that wealth, fame, and privilege can protect against tragedy. In Brentwood, as in much of the world, the Reiner family had been considered untouchable. That illusion was now shattered. Amid the chaos, law enforcement quickly focused on Nick Reiner. Surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and forensic evidence pointed toward him as the primary suspect. Descriptions of his departure from the estate in a hurry, the condition of the scene, and his movements immediately afterward formed a preliminary timeline that investigators would continue to piece together in the days to follow. Every detail mattered, every second counted, and every action would be scrutinized in court. Tracy Reiner's alleged involvement adds yet another layer of complexity. While Nick is the suspected perpetrator, questions about her actions before, during, and after the crime dominate the narrative. Did she attempt to intervene? Did she assist her brother out of fear, loyalty, or some other motive? These questions not only shape the legal proceedings, but also frame public perception of the family and the tragedy. Every new report adds to a growing sense of disbelief. How could familial bonds become so entangled with criminal acts? But the day was far from over. As the investigation unfolded, further shocking details emerged. Police recovered evidence suggesting that the events were not a spontaneous act of violence, but part of a more complex series of actions that had begun earlier than initially reported. Interviews with neighbors revealed strange behaviors in the days leading up to the tragedy. Movements, arguments, and interactions that, in hindsight, hint at an underlying tension within the family. These seemingly small details now take on a far greater significance, painting a picture of a household simmering with conflict beneath the veneer of Hollywood polish. Public reaction was swift and intense. Headlines screamed with the words Hollywood horror and family tragedy, while social media users speculated on motives, family dynamics, and the unfolding legal battle. Fans of Rob Reiner's work expressed grief not just for his loss, but for the shocking betrayal that the allegations suggested. Questions about Tracy's role and her motivations became central points of discussion, fueling debates, analyses, and widespread fascination with a story that was both tragic and deeply compelling. Meanwhile, authorities moved quickly. Nick Reiner was apprehended, and Tracy Reiner's actions were investigated with meticulous care. Legal experts analyzed the potential charges, the implications of aiding and abetting, and the likely trajectory of the case. Court filings, public statements, and eyewitness reports all began to form a narrative that was as complex as it was disturbing. For those watching from afar, the case became more than a crime story. It was a psychological puzzle, a moral quandary, and a public spectacle rolled into one. And yet, even amid the procedural unfolding, there remained unanswered questions. What prompted Nick Reiner to commit such a violent act? What role did Tracy truly play? Were there warning signs that could have prevented the tragedy? And what about the rest of the family, friends, and community? How did they reconcile the person they knew with the actions now under investigation? These questions would dominate headlines and courtrooms for months, leaving everyone involved grappling with shock, grief, and disbelief. As evening fell on that day in Brentwood, the reality began to set in. 2 lives were lost, a family forever changed, and the narrative of a Hollywood household had been irreversibly rewritten. The quiet streets, once serene, now carried the echoes of tragedy, speculation, and the weight of questions that might never fully be answered. And at the center of it all was Tracy Reiner. A daughter, a sister, a figure now embroiled in a story that would continue to unfold in the most dramatic and unexpected ways. But what would happen next in the courtroom, when the world would finally see Tracy Reiner confronted with the reality of her alleged actions? How would the trial reveal secrets, tensions, and betrayals that had been hidden behind the closed doors of the Reiner estate for years? The answers, when they came, would shock even those who thought they understood the full scope of this Hollywood tragedy. The moment the Reiner tragedy hit the news, the city of Los Angeles and the world of Hollywood were thrown into shock. By Sunday evening, law enforcement had cordoned off the Brentwood estate, turning the normally quiet neighborhood into a hive of activity. Police cars, detectives, and forensic teams swarmed the property, their flashing lights cutting through the late afternoon calm. The presence of cameras and journalists from every major outlet only intensified the tension, turning what was once a private family residence into a public spectacle. For authorities, the investigation began with urgency. Homicide detectives moved quickly to secure the scene, document evidence, and begin interviews with neighbors and family acquaintances. Each detail mattered: the time of death, the position of the bodies, the state of the home, and any potential witnesses or surveillance footage that could illuminate what had transpired. In cases like this, every second can be pivotal, and law enforcement treated the situation with the utmost precision. At the same time, media coverage exploded. The name, Reiner, carries weight in Hollywood. News of the deaths spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media was flooded with speculation, condolences, and questions about the circumstances of the tragedy. Journalists began piecing together timelines, cross-referencing public appearances, and contacting sources familiar with the family. For viewers, the story was irresistible. A Hollywood family, famous, successful, and admired, shattered by violence within their own home. The intrigue was immediate, the emotional stakes high, and the questions unrelenting. As the investigation unfolded, police quickly zeroed in on Nick Reiner. According to initial reports, he was apprehended within hours, his movements tracked by security footage and eyewitness accounts. The arrest itself was dramatic. Authorities described a tense moment as he was taken into custody, his demeanor a mixture of defiance and shock. The news of his arrest ignited further media frenzy, as pundits and viewers tried to piece together how a man from such a prominent family could allegedly commit an act of such violence. But while Nick was in custody, attention soon turned to Tracy Reiner. Her alleged involvement, providing aid to her brother, became a key focus for investigators. While the public had initially assumed the crime was a sudden, isolated act, Tracy's role suggested a more complicated narrative. Legal analysts quickly began discussing potential charges, exploring what it meant to be implicated in aiding and abetting a violent crime. Was she complicit before, during, or after the act? Could her motivations be explained by fear, loyalty, or something more sinister? The ambiguity only heightened public curiosity. As law enforcement combed the Reiner estate for evidence, details began to emerge that were both shocking and surreal. Forensic teams meticulously documented the scene, noting not only the violence of the attack, but also subtle clues that hinted at premeditation. Items moved, doors opened or closed in unusual ways, and traces of activity suggested a sequence of events more complicated than initially imagined. Each new piece of evidence would later become a critical point in court, revealing the chilling precision of the crime and the complex involvement of those close to the family. Meanwhile, the media narrative took on a life of its own. News outlets aired live reports from outside the estate. Interviews with neighbors added human context, and speculation ran rampant on social media platforms. For some, the story became a moral puzzle. How could a family so respected in public life harbor the tensions, conflicts, and secrets that seemed to culminate in this horrifying act? For others, it became a story of Hollywood obsession. The fascination with fame, scandal, and the private lives of the rich and powerful amplified every detail, every rumor, and every claim. Investigators also faced the challenge of separating fact from fiction. In high-profile cases, misinformation spreads quickly, complicating efforts to understand the truth. Early reports about Tracy's involvement varied, sometimes contradicting each other, leaving authorities to sift through conflicting accounts while maintaining a clear and accurate timeline. Every phone record, text message, and witness statement became crucial, and each revelation raised more questions than answers. What did Tracy know before the attack? How did she respond afterward? Were there warning signs ignored or misunderstood? Legal experts watching the case were quick to weigh in. The allegations against Tracy carried serious consequences. If proven true, aiding and abetting a murder can carry penalties almost as severe as committing the act itself. Courts would scrutinize her actions, her intent, and her mental state, while the public waited for answers. The courtroom, already becoming a stage for drama, promised even more revelations as the legal process unfolded. Amid the investigation, public reaction grew increasingly intense. Fans of Rob and Michelle expressed grief and disbelief. Hollywood insiders shared personal memories, painting a picture of a family that had inspired, mentored, and touched lives in profound ways. And yet, the darker narrative of familial betrayal and complicity began to dominate. Headlines shifted from mourning the loss of two beloved figures to questioning the motives, loyalties, and morality of those closest to them. Tracy Reiner, once seen as part of the family's bright legacy, became the focal point of scrutiny and speculation. For the investigators, the stakes were high. They knew the world was watching every move, every discovery, and every statement. The pressure to be thorough, precise, and transparent was immense. Every piece of evidence had to be meticulously documented, every timeline verified, and every witness carefully interviewed. The goal was not just to solve a crime, but to ensure that justice could be served in a case that had captured global attention. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that the story was far from straightforward. The Reiner household, once a symbol of stability and creativity, was a place where tensions, resentments, and complex relationships had quietly simmered for years. Friends, family acquaintances, and insiders hinted at disagreements and conflicts that, though private, may have played a role in the events of that Sunday. Understanding these dynamics became as important as understanding the physical evidence itself. And just when investigators thought they had a clearer picture, another revelation emerged, one that would shift public perception, add new layers to the case, and deepen the mystery surrounding Tracy Reiner's role. Details about her whereabouts, actions, and statements during the critical hours after the murders suggested a level of involvement that shocked both law enforcement and the public. Questions multiplied. Did she act out of fear, loyalty, or something else entirely? Could her actions be excused, explained, or justified? And most importantly, how would the courtroom handle the weight of these revelations? By the end of the first week, the investigation had already revealed enough to make the case one of the most talked-about tragedies in recent Hollywood history. Every day brought new twists, new testimonies, and new questions, leaving the public glued to headlines and updates. For law enforcement, journalists, and the global audience, the Reiner family tragedy was no longer just a shocking crime. It had become a window into human psychology, familial dynamics, and the complexities of fame and fortune. The public's fascination with the Reiner tragedy took a sharp turn when Tracy Reiner, the daughter, became a central figure in the unfolding drama. Up until that point, the focus had been primarily on Nick Reiner, the alleged perpetrator of the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner. But with the spotlight now on Tracy, the narrative shifted. How could a daughter, raised in privilege, surrounded by love and opportunity, allegedly aid in such a devastating crime? And how would she handle the weight of the world watching her every move? The morning of Tracy Reiner's arrest was tense and chaotic. Law enforcement officials approached with caution, aware of the high-profile nature of the case. Media vans lined the streets outside her residence, cameras trained on every possible moment. Social media buzzed with speculation. Would she resist arrest? Would she make a public statement? Would there be any indication of guilt, fear, or remorse? The answers would soon begin to emerge, setting the stage for a courtroom drama that captured global attention. Tracy was taken into custody without incident, though the demeanor she displayed in those first moments would become a point of intense analysis. Observers noted her composure, but also the flashes of emotion, a hand trembling, eyes darting, a visible tension that suggested both fear and disbelief. It was as if the enormity of the allegations was crashing down all at once, and every movement was being scrutinized by law enforcement, media, and the public simultaneously. From there, Tracy was transported to the courthouse, a building that suddenly became a symbol of justice, scrutiny, and the theater of human drama. Inside, the weight of the case pressed down on her, and the cameras outside documented every step. Journalists speculated on her motivations, her mental state, and her potential defense strategy. Analysts debated whether her role constituted simple familial loyalty, coerced complicity, or a deeper, more calculated involvement. Every eye in the courtroom, every lens outside, seemed poised to capture a revelation. The courtroom appearances that followed were electric with tension. Tracy, now formally facing charges for allegedly aiding and abetting her brother in the murders of their parents, had to confront not only the legal implications but also the public narrative forming around her. The judge, maintaining a strict demeanor, outlined the severity of the charges, emphasizing the gravity of the crime and the potential consequences. Each word seemed to reverberate in the courtroom, weighing heavily on Tracy, her family, and everyone following the case. It was during one of these appearances that the world witnessed an extraordinary, haunting moment. Tracy Reiner collapsed after the judge announced the life sentence for the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner. Cameras captured the raw, human vulnerability in that instant. A daughter overcome by grief, shock, or perhaps guilt, collapsing under the weight of a reality that had been unimaginable just hours earlier. Observers debated the meaning of her collapse. Was it remorse? Fear of the consequences? Or simply the emotional toll of confronting the tragic reality of losing her parents in such a horrific manner while facing her own potential criminal liability? This moment became iconic in the media coverage of the case. Social media erupted with images and clips, debates raged on talk shows and news outlets, and analysts dissected every nuance of her behavior. The collapse symbolized, for many, the human dimension of this tragedy, the raw emotion that can't be captured in headlines or court documents, but which lays bare the complexity of human responses to grief, shock, and trauma. Legal experts explained that while emotional displays can be human, they do not absolve responsibility. Tracy's alleged actions, whether motivated by fear, loyalty, or other factors, were under scrutiny. Court filings highlighted potential communications between her and Nick, evidence of assistance in the aftermath of the murders, and behaviors that investigators argued indicated complicity. Each revelation painted a picture of a family tragedy that was as psychologically intricate as it was legally serious. The courtroom drama also revealed the emotional toll on the rest of the family and friends. Witnesses described the strain of watching a once-beloved family torn apart, of reconciling the public image of Rob and Michelle with the private reality of their deaths. Attorneys, psychologists, and family friends speculated about underlying dynamics. Tensions that had quietly existed, conflicts unspoken, and pressures that may have contributed to this shocking outcome. Every testimony, every detail, added depth to a story that was both heartbreaking and almost surreal in its intensity. Outside the courtroom, the public reacted with a mixture of fascination, sympathy, and condemnation. Some empathized with Tracy, noting the impossible position she was allegedly placed in. Others questioned her moral and legal responsibility, debating whether aiding a sibling in such circumstances could ever be justified. The global audience seemed captivated not just by the crime itself, but by the human drama unfolding in real time. A daughter caught between familial loyalty, grief, and the law. The media also began digging into Tracy's history, seeking patterns that might explain her alleged actions. Interviews with acquaintances, former colleagues, and neighbors hinted at a complex personality, fiercely loyal, sometimes volatile, and deeply enmeshed in family dynamics that could be both supportive and suffocating. These insights, while anecdotal, helped create a fuller portrait of a woman navigating a life steeped in both privilege and pressure, now facing accusations that would define her legacy in ways no one could have predicted. And just as the courtroom drama intensified, so too did speculation about what would happen next. Would Tracy cooperate with prosecutors? Would her testimony reveal new details about Nick's actions, the family dynamics, or the events leading up to that fateful Sunday? Could her role in the tragedy shift the focus of the investigation, exposing new layers of deception, loyalty, or betrayal? Each question added tension, creating a narrative that felt almost cinematic in its suspense. By the end of this chapter in the story, Tracy Reiner had become more than just a figure in a news headline. She was a symbol of the human complexity underlying this tragedy, a daughter, a sister, a human being confronting grief, fear, and allegations of complicity in the most shocking of circumstances. And as the trial continued, every move, every expression, Every word from her courtroom appearances promised to reveal more of the story, keeping the world riveted and the narrative moving toward truths that were as disturbing as they were compelling. The courtroom became the stage for a drama that the world could hardly believe was real. Every seat was filled, every camera aimed, and every word spoken carried weight. Tracy Reiner, the daughter now at the center of an unimaginable tragedy, faced charges that could define the rest of her life. But beyond the legal technicalities, the trial revealed layers of family tension, hidden resentments, and shocking behaviors that had been buried beneath years of Hollywood glamour. The first day of testimony set the tone. Witnesses were called to recount the events leading up to the tragedy. Neighbors described strange occurrences in the days before the murders. Unusual car movements, raised voices behind closed doors, and a tension that seemed palpable even from the outside. Some reported seeing Nick leaving the estate at odd hours, while others hinted at heated arguments between the siblings. These seemingly small details, at first dismissed as minor domestic issues, suddenly took on far greater significance. They became pieces of a puzzle that investigators and the public struggled to assemble. Forensic evidence was next. Crime scene investigators walked the jury and audience through the Reiner estate, detailing the positions of Rob and Michelle's bodies, the injuries sustained, and traces of activity suggesting that the attack was both violent and precise. Each fact was accompanied by photographs, diagrams, and testimony from experts, making the horror tangible for everyone in the courtroom. Observers noted the meticulousness of the forensic analysis, from blood spatter patterns to fingerprints, and how these details painted a chilling picture of the events that had occurred. Then came the more personal testimonies. Friends, colleagues, and family acquaintances spoke, often reluctantly, about the family dynamics. Some described Tracy as fiercely loyal to her brother, someone who might go to great lengths to protect family members. Others mentioned subtle tensions, disagreements, and conflicts that, while normal in many families, seemed magnified under the pressures of fame and public scrutiny. These insights created a portrait of a household both loving and volatile, where underlying resentments may have contributed to the tragic outcome. Perhaps most shocking were the testimonies related to Tracy's alleged involvement. Investigators detailed communications between her and Nick, highlighting moments that suggested assistance in the aftermath of the murders. Legal analysts explained that aiding and abetting does not require direct participation in the act itself. Helping a suspect escape, conceal evidence, or otherwise obstruct justice can carry severe penalties. Each new piece of evidence raised the stakes for Tracy, forcing the courtroom and the world to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, morality, and accountability. Witnesses also revealed interactions that occurred immediately after the murders. Some reported seeing Tracy making calls, moving items, or engaging in behaviors that investigators interpreted as aiding her brother. These accounts, combined with forensic evidence and digital records, painted a complex picture. One in which familial bonds, fear, and possible coercion intersected with criminal actions. For the public, it was both shocking and compelling, a story that challenged assumptions about family, trust, and morality. Psychological experts were also brought in to provide context. They spoke about the dynamics of high-pressure families, the effects of fame, and the ways in which loyalty can sometimes blur ethical boundaries. In their testimony, they emphasized that while these factors may explain certain behaviors, they do not excuse criminal actions. For Tracy, these insights added depth to her case, offering possible context without absolution. For the jury and viewers, they provided a lens through which to understand the complexities of human behavior in extreme circumstances. Courtroom observers noted the emotional weight of the proceedings. Tracy appeared visibly strained as each witness spoke, her reactions carefully monitored by attorneys and the judge. There were moments when she seemed overwhelmed, subtle shifts in expression suggesting fear, anxiety, or perhaps the crushing reality of facing a world scrutinizing every action. These human moments contrasted sharply with the cold, analytical presentation of evidence, highlighting the intersection of emotion and law in a way that gripped the audience. Then came the bombshell testimony from a neighbor who claimed to have seen Nick and Tracy together on the morning of the murders, in a sequence of movements that contradicted their initial statements. The details were specific, dramatic, and deeply incriminating. Actions, conversations, and timing that suggested premeditation and complicity. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Reporters leaned forward. Social media erupted with speculation. For many, this was the moment that transformed the case from tragic to almost unimaginable. Could a daughter really be implicated in aiding her brother in such a horrifying act? Further evidence came in the form of digital records, phone calls, text messages, and location tracking that placed Tracy in proximity to critical events. Legal analysts explained how these records could establish knowledge, intent, and involvement, key factors in determining culpability. Each revelation added tension, creating a narrative that was equal parts criminal investigation, psychological study, and human drama. For the public, it was irresistible, each detail building suspense and deepening the sense of shock. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, there were contradictions. Some witnesses painted Tracy as hesitant, conflicted, or even trying to prevent harm. These moments introduced uncertainty, leaving the jury and audience questioning her motives. Was she acting out of fear, loyalty, or confusion? Or was there a darker intent hidden beneath the surface? These contradictions made the story unpredictable, keeping viewers on edge and eager for the next revelation. And just when it seemed the courtroom had revealed everything, the most dramatic moment occurred. A previously undisclosed recording surfaced, capturing a heated exchange between Tracy and Nick in the hours surrounding the crime. The content of the conversation was explosive, filled with tension, emotion, and hints of planning. The audio was played in court, and the reaction was immediate. Lawyers paused, the judge leaned forward, and the courtroom audience murmured in disbelief. It was a revelation that would dominate headlines for days, reshaping the public understanding of the case and raising new questions about Tracy's role. By the end of the day, the trial had transformed from a shocking news story into a gripping, real-life thriller. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, and every witness added layers to the narrative, revealing a family both human and tragic, complex and heartbreaking. Tracy Reiner, once seen as a daughter caught in the crossfire of circumstance, had become a central figure in a story that challenged assumptions, provoked moral debate, and captivated a global audience. The courtroom was electric. Every detail of the Reiner family tragedy was under scrutiny, and the prosecution was about to present a case that would shock even seasoned observers. What unfolded in those sessions would not just describe a crime. It would reconstruct the moments leading up to, during, and after the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner in a way that left the courtroom and the world gripping their seats. The prosecution opened with a dramatic statement that the murders were not random, nor a spur-of-the-moment act, but the culmination of long-simmering tensions, grievances, and conflicts within the Reiner family. They emphasized that both Nick and Tracy were implicated in ways that went beyond simple familial loyalty, that their actions were deliberate, coordinated, and, at times, calculated. The words hung in the air like a storm waiting to strike, capturing the attention of jurors, reporters, and viewers alike. To establish motive, the prosecution painted a portrait of a family under pressure. Financial disputes, interpersonal tensions, and unresolved conflicts were introduced as critical context. Witnesses described disagreements over family matters, creative projects, and personal decisions, which, when combined with the pressures of living under public scrutiny, created an environment fraught with emotional volatility. The prosecution argued that these underlying tensions were not minor squabbles, but factors that contributed directly to the alleged crimes. Each point was carefully illustrated, linking personal grievances to the alleged actions of Nick and Tracy. Next came the timeline reconstruction, presented with meticulous detail. Using surveillance footage, phone records, and eyewitness testimony, the prosecution laid out a minute-by-minute account of the events on the day of the murders. From early morning movements around the estate to actions taken immediately afterward, every moment was scrutinized. The jury, the courtroom, and the public were given a detailed map of how the tragedy unfolded, showing not just the brutality of the acts, but also the involvement of Tracy in critical moments. Each step, each movement, was framed as part of a chain of decisions with devastating consequences. Evidence was then presented in sequence, each piece building upon the last. Forensic experts described the crime scene in painstaking detail, highlighting how patterns of blood spatter, fingerprints, and other traces indicated both the sequence and the force of the attacks. Investigators testified about items moved or concealed, actions that the prosecution argued showed knowledge and intent. Digital evidence, including phone calls, text messages, and location data, was introduced, showing Tracy's proximity to critical events and her communications with Nick. Each new revelation added pressure, building a compelling argument that the case against both siblings was not only strong, but undeniable. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony regarding the immediate aftermath of the murders. Witnesses described Tracy allegedly assisting Nick, moving items, making calls, and taking actions that prosecutors argued were meant to aid her brother in avoiding detection. The prosecution emphasized that aiding and abetting does not require physical participation in the murder itself. Providing assistance before, during, or after the crime can constitute serious legal responsibility. For Tracy, this line of reasoning placed her squarely in the spotlight, transforming public perception of her from grieving daughter to active participant. The prosecution also introduced communications between Tracy and Nick in the days leading up to the murders. While some messages seemed innocuous, others suggested planning, tension, and discussions that, when combined with the events that followed, painted a chilling picture. Experts explained that these communications could indicate foreknowledge or intent, key elements in establishing criminal liability. For the jury, the implications were stark. The crime may not have been a sudden outburst, but part of a calculated series of decisions with devastating consequences. Additionally, financial records and other documents were presented, illustrating potential disputes, disagreements, or pressures within the family. The prosecution argued that these factors, while subtle on their own, contributed to a context in which the tragic events became possible. They framed the Reiner family not just as victims of a crime, but as participants in a complex web of relationships, emotions, and unresolved tensions. One that the defendants exploited, whether consciously or subconsciously, to commit the alleged acts. Emotional testimony was also woven into the prosecution's case. Friends and colleagues of Rob and Michelle described the couple's devotion to family, their generosity, and their commitment to supporting their children's ambitions. These accounts humanized the victims, reminding the jury and the public that the Reiners were not just figures in a sensational news story, but real people, with lives, dreams, and legacies destroyed in an instant. The contrast between their warmth and the brutality of their deaths amplified the emotional stakes of the trial. Perhaps the most gripping moment came when the prosecution played surveillance footage from inside and outside the estate. The clips, carefully timed and annotated, showed movements, interactions, and behaviors that seemed to corroborate other evidence. Tracy's actions, from her movements to her communications, were highlighted as pivotal in understanding the sequence of events. The courtroom gasped at the implications, as the visual record made the alleged involvement undeniable. Throughout the prosecution's presentation, they continually framed Tracy's role as one of moral and legal responsibility. Even if she did not commit the murders herself, her alleged assistance and coordination with Nick placed her actions in the realm of criminal liability. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, each expert analysis reinforced this narrative, creating a compelling, cohesive argument that would resonate with the jury and the public alike. Yet, the prosecution did not stop there. They teased additional revelations to come. Pieces of evidence, witness accounts, and expert insights that would further complicate Tracy's defense and deepen the narrative of betrayal, loyalty, and family conflict. These hints kept everyone on edge, reinforcing the sense that the story was far from complete and that the most shocking disclosures were still ahead. As the day ended, the courtroom was left with a powerful, chilling picture. A daughter implicated in aiding her brother, a meticulously reconstructed timeline of horrific events, and a family's private tensions exposed for all to see. The prosecution had delivered a case that combined emotion, evidence, and narrative clarity, setting the stage for the defense's response and the next chapter of courtroom drama. The courtroom fell silent as the defense team took the floor. After days of the prosecution presenting a meticulous, damning case against Tracy and Nick Reiner, the tension was palpable. Journalists leaned forward. Cameras captured every movement, and the public waited anxiously to hear the version of events from the daughter at the center of this unprecedented tragedy. The defense opened with a bold, emotionally charged statement. They acknowledged the gravity of the charges, but immediately framed Tracy's involvement in a new light. As a daughter caught between love for her brother and shock at the events that had unfolded. According to their narrative, Tracy did not plan, condone, or participate in the murders. Instead, they argued, her alleged actions afterward were motivated by fear, confusion, and a desperate attempt to protect herself and her sibling in a situation spiraling out of control. Tracy herself took the stand, her appearance alone sending waves of emotion through the courtroom. She appeared tense, composed at times, yet visibly shaken, a woman confronting the unimaginable. Her testimony began with an account of the morning of the murders, her voice trembling as she described discovering the aftermath of the crime. She spoke of disbelief, horror, and the immediate fear of what to do next. The room hung on every word, witnessing a daughter grappling with trauma that had turned her life upside down in an instant. The defense carefully constructed Tracy's timeline, presenting moments that contradicted or complicated the prosecution's narrative. They highlighted periods when she was unaccounted for, explaining that she was not actively assisting Nick, but rather reacting to an unprecedented and shocking event. Every detail was analyzed to cast doubt on the idea that she had foreknowledge or intent to aid in criminal activity. They emphasized that fear, panic, and familial loyalty can drive people to make decisions that appear suspicious but are rooted in human vulnerability. Psychological experts were called to testify, providing context for Tracy's behavior. They explained how extreme stress, trauma, and family dynamics can affect decision-making. These testimonies suggested that Tracy's alleged assistance could be interpreted as instinctual, emotionally driven reactions rather than deliberate criminal acts. The jury was asked to consider the human element, the complexity of emotions, fear, and loyalty, in evaluating her culpability. Defense attorneys also scrutinized the prosecution's evidence. They questioned the interpretation of digital communications, arguing that texts and calls were misrepresented or taken out of context. Surveillance footage, they contended, did not prove intentional involvement, but rather showed movement that could be explained by panic or attempts to seek help. Every point was designed to create doubt, challenge assumptions, and present a counter-narrative that painted Tracy not as a co-conspirator, but as a woman navigating a horrifying situation. The emotional impact of Tracy's testimony was undeniable. At moments, she paused, tears forming, recounting her parents' love, guidance, and the normalcy of life before that Sunday morning. She spoke of Rob and Michelle not as public figures, but as her parents. The people who had nurtured her, guided her, and built a family filled with shared memories. Her vulnerability resonated with the courtroom, humanizing a figure who had been painted in the media as both a grieving daughter and a potential accomplice. Witnesses for the defense added further context. Friends and colleagues described Tracy as loyal, compassionate, and overwhelmed by the events surrounding her family. They emphasized her emotional state, portraying a woman struggling to reconcile grief, fear, and legal scrutiny. These testimonies aimed to show that while her actions may have been flawed, they were not malicious, a subtle but powerful argument for mitigating responsibility. However, the defense's narrative was not without tension. They had to balance sympathy with accountability, portraying Tracy as a real person capable of error, yet not a criminal mastermind complicit in the murders. Every statement was carefully measured, every testimony framed to appeal to both the jury's sense of justice and empathy. It was a delicate, high-stakes performance, one that required emotional resonance without undermining legal strategy. As the defense continued, they introduced evidence of Tracy's attempts to alert authorities, seek help, and manage the aftermath in a way consistent with panic and confusion rather than calculated intent. These actions were presented as crucial moments that distinguished her behavior from Nick's, highlighting differences in decision-making and intent. The argument was clear. Even in the shadow of tragedy, Tracy's actions were human, flawed, but not criminally motivated. Yet, the prosecution was not silent. They interjected, questioning inconsistencies, emphasizing patterns of behavior, and suggesting that fear does not erase accountability. Every contradiction, every unexplained action, became a point of contention, leaving the jury to navigate a complex web of evidence, testimony, and emotional narratives. The tension was almost unbearable. Every word spoken in that courtroom seemed to pull the audience deeper into the story, alternating between sympathy and shock. The chapter's climax came with a chilling reminder. While the defense argued for humanity, compassion, and context, the prosecution hinted at evidence yet to be revealed, communications, movements, and behaviors that could redefine Tracy's role entirely. The courtroom